We just harvested a great crop of onions from the side bed of this polytunnel, but the last time I grew onions in this bed, the crop had been a disaster. The polytunnel was fairly new with that last crop. The soil had not been well developed, there were some fertility issues. I had let the weeds grow too big, which crowded out the plants, and most of the crop was seriously affected by downy mildew. I ended up abandoning the full crop and pulling it out, and focused on developing the soil with better fertility and weed management, and over the years I've learned more about growing onions in the other gardens. So I was a bit more confident that we would get a good crop this year when we planted the same bed of the polytunnel with 6 different varieties of onions grown from seed. The seedlings were transplanted early in the spring as multi-sown clusters with lots of plants fairly close together. We had plans to remove the middle row of plants as larger scallions or green onions to get an early crop, and to reduce the density of the bed and to allow more movement between the plants as they got bigger. There were some weed issues early on, with lots of tiny weed seedlings emerging, because I had let some weeds go to seed a few years ago, and it did take a fair amount of effort to keep this bed clear of weeds. Once established, the plants grew really well as the weather warmed up, and they seemed to be enough fertility and generally good growing conditions. We only ended up harvesting a few of the clusters as green onions, as we had more than enough scallions from the other gardens and other beds, and the plants seemed to be growing well despite the crowding. As they started to mature, there was no signs of mildew or other diseases, or with lots of the plants bolting or with the bulbs splitting, which are issues that I've had with other crops in the past. We stopped watering this bed as the plants started to lodge or fall over, and we left the plants to continue to dry off as we had no immediate plans for this bed. And because there was no chance of rain in the polytunnel, I figured they would be fine where they were. We have been gradually harvesting some of the onions as we needed them, and yesterday we finally pulled out all of the rest of the plants and laid them out on the bed so the roots could start to dry off. It was definitely a better crop than I had expected, with lots of large, well-shaped onions, especially with some of the varieties, with only a few plants that had bolted or bulbs that had split or decayed. I was surprised that the density of the plants didn't cause problems with disease, and perhaps we were fortunate that there is not a lot of downy mildew around this season. But I'd like to think that better soil development and fertility, as well as proper weeding and care for the crop, made a difference and allowed us to grow a really big and early crop of onions under cover this year.